The third mortar round dropped dead center on the position, and 200 meters east, flat in the dirt, Petty Officer First Class Riley Garza heard the one thing a sniper is trained to recognize and pray she never does: the clean, confirmed rhythm of a crew that already knows exactly where the target is. Short. Over. Then dead on the money. She was already up and running across open ground before the third impact stopped echoing off the valley walls, sprinting toward a column of smoke where the best man she had ever known had been breathing 4 seconds ago, screaming his call sign into a radio that had already gone to static. She didn't make it. Nobody could have made it, and that was the entire point. Somebody had made sure of it 8,000 miles, and one bank transfer before that first tube ever fired. When she reached the position, there was nothing left to do but the count, and the count came up one short, and the one it came up short was the only one that had ever mattered to her. 8 months later, they folded a flag at a cemetery in Coronado and handed it to a widow who would never understand what was actually inside that box. Riley stood at the back of the line in a black coat that wasn't a uniform, watching a triangle of cloth pass from one pair of white gloves to another. She didn't cry. The people who knew her noticed that, and they told themselves she was being strong. She wasn't being strong. She was doing arithmetic. $380,000. That was the going rate for a grid square, it turned out. That was what a man's life had been sold for, down to the last digit, and she knew the number because she had spent 8 months finding it. She folded that number into her coat pocket like a second flag and walked to her truck before they finished playing taps. The headstone would say training accident. She knew better. She'd read the file. Now hold on. Hold on just a second, friend, and let me sit down here with you before we go one more step into this thing. My name's not important to this story. What's important is that I spent the better part of 30 years around the kind of people the rest of the world only ever sees in a movie or on a folded flag, and I learned a long time ago that the truest stories are the ones nobody's allowed to tell at the funeral. This is one of those. I'm going to tell it to you anyway, because somebody decided it was time, and because the woman at the center of it earned the telling whether she'd want it or not. I'll be straight with you, the way I always am. This one sounds taller every time it gets told. There are pieces of this that sound like something out of a film, and I'm not going to stand here with my hand up and swear to you that every detail came to me clean. Some of it I had from a man who was on that range with her at Coronado. Some of it I had from a chief who watched her work and never said her name out loud again after. And some of it I'm telling you the way the teens tell it now, late at night, low voices, the way a thing becomes a legend because the truth of it was too heavy to carry any other way. So don't ask me to prove the parts that sound impossible. Just sit with me. Listen the way you'd listen to an old man on a porch who was close enough to the fire to still smell the smoke. Here's what I know for certain. Riley Garza was a Navy SEAL sniper, and before you tell me that billet didn't exist the way I'm describing it, let me tell you that the most interesting people I ever met spent their whole careers being things that officially didn't exist. She came up through a pipeline that breaks most people, and it didn't break her. And the men she came up with will tell you to this day that she was the quietest, dangerous person any of them ever stood next to. Not loud dangerous. Not the kind that has to show you. The other kind. The kind that's already done the math on the room before you've finished walking into it. And Marcus Webb was her spotter. 4 years. 4 years, friend. You understand what that means in that line of work? A sniper and a spotter aren't a team. They're one animal with two heartbeats. He reads the wind she sends around, and there is not 1 inch of daylight between his voice in her ear and the muscle in her finger. For years of lying in the same hole, for years of splitting the same canteen, breathing the same dust, learning each other so deep that she could hear the hesitation in his breathing before he knew he was hesitating. Marcus was a big, easygoing man out of Mobile, Alabama, a fisherman's son who could feel a wind shift in the hair on his forearms before any instrument on the planet caught it. He had a wife named Tessa and a little girl named June, and before every single mission he'd touch the left breast pocket of his camis twice, 2 light taps, where he kept her photograph, and then he'd go quiet, and then the 2 of them would go to work. 2 taps. Every time. I want you to hold on to that. You'll understand it before we're done. A set of coordinates got sold to a man with money and a uniform, and those coordinates ended up in the hands of a local faction that had been waiting a long time for exactly the gift, and Marcus Webb did not come home. And the man who signed the report that turned all of that into the words training accident, the man who made the lie official, the man whose signature closed the file so nobody would ever go looking, was a Navy captain named Dale Whitmore. Sit down, friend. Pour yourself something, if you've got it. Let me tell you who she was, and let me tell you what she did about it, because this one doesn't get told often. The ones who could tell it mostly chose silence instead. I'm choosing different tonight. She was born in Brownsville, Texas, 3 miles from the river, the youngest of 4 and the only girl. Her daddy ran a small engine repair shop, lawnmowers, outboards, the occasional generator hauled in off a shrimp boat, and Riley grew up with grease worked so deep into her knuckles that it never fully came out, and with an understanding of machines that most people never get, because most people are never quiet enough to hear what a machine is trying to tell them. That's the thing about her you've got to keep in your hand the whole way through this. She listened. From the time she was small, she was the one who could sit in a room full of her loud brothers and her louder father and pick out the single sound that didn't belong. She knew at 9 years old which outboard on the workbench would run and which one was going to break somebody's heart, and she knew it before anybody touched a wrench, because she'd been listening to it the whole time everyone else was talking. She enlisted at 19. Not for some flag-waving dream. I'll respect her too much to dress it up for you. She enlisted because the shop wasn't ever going to feed 5 people, and because something in her needed to find out how far down the quiet went. Turned out it went a long way. She qualified expert with a rifle in her first week without trying hard, and an instructor who'd watched a few thousand shooters come through pulled her off the line and asked her the question that bent the whole rest of her life in a new direction. He asked her what she'd been thinking about when she fired, and Riley told him the truth because she didn't yet know how to do anything else. She said she hadn't been thinking about anything at all. She said the noise in her head went quiet right before the trigger broke, quieter than it ever got anywhere else in her whole life, and that for about half a second the entire world narrowed down to one clean line between her and the thing at the far end of it. That instructor had heard every answer there was to that question. He'd never heard that one. And that is how a girl from a screen door repair shop in Brownsville ended up walking a path that most people don't even know is there. Stay with me, friend. The path gets dark from here. But she walked it with her eyes open, and the least we can do is keep ours open too. Let me take you back to the day she met Marcus Webb, because the whole shape of this thing comes out of that one afternoon, and I'd be cheating you if I skipped it. It was a pre-deployment workup, a combined range evolution, and they paired the shooters off the roster more or less by chance. Marcus Drew Riley. He was 3 years senior, already wearing the rank, a big slow-moving man, with a laugh you could hear clear across the firing line and a habit of murmuring to himself low and steady while he worked a target through the glass. Most shooters would have found that murmur a distraction. Riley found it was the exact frequency her brain had been hunting for her entire life. The first stage they ran together, Marcus called a wind hold she flat out disagreed with. Too much correction, she thought, for the flag she was reading, but he was the spotter, and that's the job. So she trusted the man over her own eyes, and sent the round where he told her. It landed precisely where he'd said it would. She rolled her cheek off the stock and looked over at this grinning fisherman's son from Alabama and understood, the way you understand a key turning in a lock you didn't know was locked, that she had just met the other half of something she'd been incomplete without, and hadn't realized it. They requested each other after that. Pulled strings, traded favors, did the quiet paperwork dance that lets two people who fit like that stay fitted together. And for 4 years, they were the team the other teams measured themselves against. Not because Riley was the best pure marksman breathing, though she was close, closer than was comfortable for the men who liked to believe that mattered, but because of what lived in the space between the two of them. He'd talk her onto a target in that low Gulf Coast murmur, calling mirage and wind and the way the heat was lying to her, and she'd take everything he handed her and fold it down into a single act so clean and so quiet that the people on the receiving end never heard the sound that ended their conversation. Now here's the part one have to tell you carefully, because it's the part the file lied about, and a lie only works if you understand the truth it was built to bury. The mission was a coordination element. Riley and Marcus attached to a small team, set in to watch a valley road and called a picture for the people who needed it. Routine, by the standards of people for whom nothing is routine. They split the element the morning it happened. Riley got pulled 200 meters east to glass a secondary approach somebody upstairs had gotten nervous about. That tasking is the only reason she's alive to be in this story, and she has had 8 months and the rest of her life to sit with the particular weight of that. She was lying in the dirt watching an empty goat trail when the first tube fired. I told you she listened. I told you that was the thing about her. So when those 3 rounds came in, she didn't hear what the report later claimed everybody heard. She didn't hear an insurgent crew stumbling onto a position by bad luck. Indirect fire is a sloppy, groping art, friend. It takes adjustment. It takes a spotter of their own walking the rounds in. It takes time, and it takes noise, and it takes mistakes. What Riley heard was none of that. She heard 3 rounds fired with the unhurried confidence of a crew that had been handed the grid before they ever dropped the first one down the tube. Short to bracket, over to bracket, then dead center, because they already knew the center. That is not a crew finding a target. That is a crew confirming a target somebody else had already found for them. She knew the difference the way you know the difference between a stranger guessing your name and a stranger reading it off your license. She carried that knowing across 200 meters of open ground at a dead sprint, and she carried it through the count that came up 1 short, and she carried it home. And when they sat her down in a fluorescent-lit office and slid the report across the table and showed her the line that said training accident, equipment failure, no enemy contact, no fault assigned, She did the only thing the situation allowed. She nodded. She signed where the man pointed. And then she went quiet, the deep quiet she'd had since she was a girl in a room full of noise, and she started listening. That's where the 8 month begins. And I want to slow us down right here, because this is the part of the story people get wrong when they tell it. They tell it like she came home and turned into a weapon overnight. She didn't. What she actually did was harder, and a great deal more frightening, and if you've ever known somebody truly patient, you already understand why. She got methodical. A coordination grid getting sold isn't magic. It's a transaction, and a transaction leaves a trail, and a trail can be followed by anybody willing to be quiet long enough and stupid enough about their own safety to keep pulling. Riley was both. Here's the math, friend, because I promised you I'd show it, and I don't make promises I walk away from. She started with the only thing she knew for certain, that the enemy had her team's grid before the shooting started. That meant the leak happened upstream, somewhere in the chain where the coordination picture lived before it ever reached the valley. She knew that chain. She'd worked inside it. So she made a list in her head, never on paper, of every position that had touched that grid in the 72 hours before the rounds fell. It wasn't a long list. The whole point of that kind of information is that it lives in very few hands. And then she started, very slowly, over months, finding out which of those hands had recently come into money they couldn't account for. That's the thread. Not a wiretap, not a hacked server, not some movie nonsense. Money. Riley understood, the way her daddy understood a misfiring engine, that you don't find the corruption by looking at the corruption. You find it by listening for the part of the machine that's running smoother than it has any right to. A chief warrant officer who'd been quietly drowning in alimony and suddenly wasn't. A contractor's invoice that didn't match any work anybody could point to. A boat. A man who'd bought a boat. And every thread she pulled, slow and patient and quiet, ran toward the same place. Up. Toward a desk. Toward a signature she already knew, because it was the signature at the bottom of the report that closed Marcus Webb's file. Captain Dale Whitmore. She had it cold by the 7th month. The grid, the broker, the foreign account, the $380,000, and the captain who'd sold the coordinates, and then signed the lie that buried the men those coordinates killed. Now you're going to ask me the same thing I asked when this came to me. You're going to ask why she didn't take it to somebody. Why she didn't walk that into an investigator's office, slap it on the desk, let the system do what the system is built to do. And friend, that's a fair question, and it deserves a real answer. So let me give you the one she'd have given you if she ever talked, which she didn't. Some folks get up after a fall, and they dust themselves off, and they get on with living. And some folks get up with a list. The system that was going to investigate Dale Whitmore was the same system that wrote training accident on Marcus Webb's headstone. It was the same chain that closed the file in 3 weeks and handed a folded flag to a 4-year-old's mother and called it finished. Riley had spent 8 months inside the machinery of how that lie got built, and she knew, with the cold clarity of a person who has stopped hoping, that a captain with a clean record and a wall full of certificates and friends 1 and 2 ranks above him does not get undone by a grieving sniper with a theory and a stack of bank records she wasn't supposed to have. He gets a lawyer. He gets a quiet retirement. He gets, if it goes very badly for him, a reprimand and a transfer. and the grid square where Marcus died stays a training accident forever. She wasn't doing arithmetic toward justice. I want to be honest with you about that, because this story doesn't work if I pretty it up. She was doing arithmetic toward a different thing entirely, an older thing, the thing the law was invented to replace precisely because it's so terrible when it gets loose. And I'm not here to tell you she was right. I've buried enough people to have stopped believing that any of this is clean. I'm only here to tell you what she did, and to ask you to sit with how she got there before you decide what you think of her. Hold that question. Don't answer it yet. We've got a long way to go, and where she went next was a quiet street in Boca Raton, Florida, where a retired Navy captain had bought himself a very nice boat with money he couldn't explain, and where he liked to stand on his back dock every single morning and watch the gulls come up off the water at 6:47, right at the edge of the light. She was already there before he ever knew her name. She'd been watching him longer than he'd been watching those birds. The house she rented sat across the inlet, a little stucco two-bedroom with a sun-faded for rent sign she answered with cash and a name that wasn't hers. The owner was an old snowbird who didn't ask questions of a polite woman in a fishing vest who paid 6 weeks up front and said she'd come down to do some early morning angling and wanted quiet. He gave her a key and a wave and drove off to wherever old snowbirds go, and Riley walked into that empty rental, set her bag on the kitchen counter, went to the back window that looked across the water at Dale Whitmore's very nice dock, and began the part of her life she was best at in all the world. She began to wait. I want to tell you about those days, friend, because the legend skips them, and the legend is poorer for it. People want the shot. They always want the shot. But anybody who's ever done that work will tell you the shot is nothing. The shot is half a second at the end of a road made entirely of waiting, and the waiting is where the whole soul of it lives. Riley spent 8 days at that window, and I'm going to walk you through them, because those 8 days are the truest portrait of who she was that this story has to offer. She kept a routine that mirrored a real angler's, so that anyone watching her would see exactly what they expected. Up before light. Coffee in a dented steel cup. Out on the little rented skiff some mornings, a rod in the holder, going through the motions a quarter mile down the inlet where she could still see his dock through a cheap pair of binoculars she'd buy at a bait shop and leave salt-crusted on the dash. Other mornings she stayed at the window, with a spotting scope set back in the shadow of the room where no glint could give it away. And she watched Dale Whitmore live his comfortable retired life, and she wrote nothing down, because she never wrote anything down, because the whole apparatus of her memory had been built by a childhood spent listening to engines, and a career spent holding 100 details in her head at once without the luxury of a notebook. 6:47. Every single morning. That was the thing she'd come to know about him better than he knew it himself. The man was a creature of deep habit, the way men become when the structure of a career falls away and they have to build little private structures to replace it. He'd come out onto that back dock with his own cup of coffee, and he'd stand at the rail, and at 6:47, give or take the time it takes a heart to beat, the gulls would come up off the water in the first real light, and he would raise an old pair of binoculars and watch them. Every morning. Like a man saying a prayer he'd forgotten the words to, and kept only the gesture of. She knew his patterns the way you know a song you've heard 10,000 times. When he took the boat out. When the cleaning lady came. When the lights went off upstairs. And I'll tell you something I can't fully explain and won't pretend to, She knew his rhythms better than a stranger 8 days and had any right to. There were things she did at that window that ran ahead of the watching, like she'd already lived these days before she lived them. I'll leave that there. Some of this woman stays in shadow, no matter how much light you bring. She built her whole life on not being seen, and even now, even in the telling, she keeps a little of herself back where you can't follow. Now, the rifle. On the third day at that window, Riley opened the long hard case she'd carried down to Florida in the bed of a truck under a tarp and a tackle box, and she took out a bolt-action rifle that had no business still existing. You remember the report, friend? No enemy contact, equipment failure, no fault assigned. That report had also listed a quantity of equipment as lost in the field, written off, gone, the kind of administrative ghosting that happens when somebody needs a story to balance. And one of the items lost in that field, according to the paperwork that turned Marcus Webb into a training accident, was the very rifle that Riley Garza now held in her hands in a rented kitchen in Boca Raton, Florida. She hadn't lost it in any field. She'd carried it out herself, in the chaos of that day, because it was the rifle she and Marcus had run together for the back half of those 4 years, and there was not one power on this earth that was going to make her leave it in the dirt. There were 3 notches carved into the buttstock. Small ones. You'd have to be close to see them, and almost nobody ever got close to Riley Garza. She cut the first one a long time ago, in a different country, on a night she never spoke about. Marcus had cut the second. The third one was new. She'd carved it the morning she signed the report, alone in her truck in that cemetery parking lot in Coronado, with the same knife her daddy had given her when she was 12, and she cut it slow and deep so it would last, and it didn't stand for anybody she killed. It stood for him. It was the only headstone she was ever going to accept for Marcus Webb, and she was carrying it across the country to lay it down in front of the man who'd sold him. Sit with that for a second. Go on. I'll wait. A woman carries the rifle her dead partner read the wind for. The rifle the paperwork swears was lost. The rifle with 2 old notches and 1 fresh one cut by her own hand in a cemetery. She carries it 1,200 yards across a Florida inlet to settle a debt the law had already closed the book on. There's a little girl named June out there somewhere growing up with a folded flag and a lie. There's a wife named Tessa who said goodbye to a sealed casket she was told not to open. And there's a woman at a rented window who is the only living soul on the planet who knows what actually happened, and who has decided that knowing is not enough. If you're still with me, and I think you are, I think you've been with me a while now, sit with that little girl and that folded flag for just a moment. That's all I'll ask of you. Just hold it. She cleaned the rifle every night. Not because it needed it, that rifle was as cared for as anything she owned, but because the cleaning was a kind of conversation, the only kind she had left with him. She'd run the bolt slow and feel the action she and Marcus had worn smooth between them over 4 years, and the oil would catch the last light through the window, and for a while the noise in her head would go quiet the way it only ever went quiet in 2 places in her whole life, behind a trigger and beside Marcus Webb. He'd been gone 8 months. Behind that rifle, in that rented kitchen, he was still close enough to murmur in her ear, "Hold a little left. Wind's lying to you. Breathe. There is." On the 8th night, she ran the math for the last time, and I'm going to show it to you, because it's the last piece of her You get to see clear before the part that lives in shadow. 1,200 yards across open water. Water does cruel things to a shot. The air over it moves different than air over land. It carries moisture that bends the bullet's path in ways a man inland never has to reckon with. And the light comes off it in a glare that lies to your eye about distance and drop. She had the range cold. She'd lasered it from the window a dozen times across a dozen mornings. She had the round. She'd built it herself, weighed the powder on a jeweler's scale, seated each bullet by hand, because a shot like this is not a thing you trust to a factory. The wind was the only animal left she couldn't fully cage, and the wind was Marcus's job, and Marcus was 8 months in the ground. So she did the thing the two of them used to do. She set a row of little telltales she could read from the window. A strip of surveyor's tape on a far piling, the lie of the flag on Widmore's own dock, the way the gulls cupped their wings coming up off the water at 6:47. And she sat in the dark, and she read the wind alone for the first time in 4 years, and somewhere in the reading she started murmuring to herself, low and steady, in a Gulf Coast cadence that wasn't hers. She was calling her own wind in his voice. She'd been beside it so long she could do it now without him, the way you keep humming a song after the radio's been switched off. And if you'd been in that room, friend, I swear to you, it would have broken something in your chest to hear it. Morning came up gray and went gold. 6:47 was 40 minutes out. And across the inlet, in a comfortable house bought with a dead man's price, Captain Dale Widmore began, for the very last time, to make his coffee. She was on the position an hour before light. Not the window. She'd never planned to fire from the window. That was for the watching. The shooting position was a low spot of weathered planking off the side of the rental's own dock, screened by a stand of sea grape and a derelict skiff somebody had left to rot on its trailer years before she ever got there. She'd chosen it on the second day. She'd lain in it 3 times since, in the dark, just to learn the wood under her, the way her hips settled, the angle her cheek wanted on the stock, so that when the morning came, her body would already know the shape of the thing, and she could give the whole of her mind to the wind. She built the position the way Marcus would have approved of, and the way she'd done it 1,000 times beside him. Rifle forward on a bag, bolt closed on a hand-built round. A second round laid on the planking by her right hand, though she knew with a flat cold certainty she would not need it. The kestrel sat beside her, but she barely looked at it now. It was a comfort object more than a tool, the way a man who's done a thing 10,000 times still glances at the manual he doesn't need. She had a granola bar in her vest pocket she'd carried for 3 days and never eaten. She had a cheap Casio on her wrist with the light worn off the button. She had no makeup and chapped lips and salt-dried white in the creases of her knuckles. And she had the most important thing a shooter can bring to a position, the thing they can't teach and can't issue. She had stillness. The kind that comes up out of the ground through your body and lays you down so quiet that the birds forget you're there. 6:20. The sky bled from black to that bruised gray that comes before color. Across the water, an upstairs light came on in Dale Widmore's house, then a downstairs one. Riley's breathing slowed. Not nervous slow. Working slow. The way a heart rate drops when a person who has trained their whole life for one specific thing finally arrives at it. 6:31. The downstairs slider opened, and the man came out onto his dock in a robe with a steaming cup, and Riley settled the reticle on him for the first time across 1,200 yards of pale teal water, And let me tell you what did not happen in that moment, because the legend always gets this part wrong. She did not feel rage. There was no fire in her, no roaring, no trembling fury that had to be mastered. There was the opposite of all that. There was the quiet, the deepest quiet of her whole life, deeper than the range at 19, deeper than any hide she'd ever shared with Marcus. And into that quiet she fed numbers. Range confirmed. Drop dialed. The flag on his own dock lay flat then lifting. A quartering wind off her left, 8, gusting 10, and she read it off the surveyor's tape and the cup of the gull's wings, and she heard the call in his voice in her ear, low and steady. Hold a little left. She's lying to you off the water. Wait for her to lay back down. So she waited. The wind gusted, and she did not break the shot. The wind gusted again, and she did not break the shot. Dale Whitmore stood at his rail and drank his coffee, and had no idea on this earth that the last decision of his life was being made for him across a stretch of water by a woman reading the breath of the morning in a dead man's cadence. And here I have to stop, friend, the way I always stop when we get to this place. Bear with an old man a moment. I've spent a lot of years now thinking about the cost of this. Not the cost to the man on the dock. I'll be honest, I've never lost much sleep over Dale Whitmore. I mean the cost to her. Because there's a thing nobody tells you about a debt like the one Riley carried, and it's this: paying it doesn't give you back what was taken. There is no arrangement of the world, no act however precise, that puts Marcus Webb back on this earth touching his breast pocket twice before he goes to work. Riley knew that. She wasn't a fool, and she wasn't crazy, and she wasn't doing this because some part of her believed it would heal her. She knew exactly what it would and would not do. She was going to lay the third notch down in front of the man who earned it, and then she was going to live the rest of her life as a person who had done that, and those are two separate weights, and she had decided to carry them both. I'm not going to stand here and call that justice. I'm not going to stand here and call it madness either. I'm going to call it what it was. It was a woman keeping the only promise she had left to keep. You can sit in judgment of that if you want to. I've found I haven't got it in me. I buried too many of the kind of men she loved. 6:46. The light came up gold off the water, and the haze burned to a glow, and somewhere off to the right the first gulls lifted off the inlet. Dale Whitmore set his coffee cup on the rail. He reached for the old binoculars hanging by the slider, and he turned toward the water the way he turned every morning, to watch the birds come up at 6:47 into the first real light of the day. The wind laid back down. She felt it before any instrument could have caught it, felt it the way Marcus used to feel it in the hair on his forearms, the way her own daddy felt a misfire coming through the floor of the shop. The quartering gust softened, the flag on the far dock went slack, and for one held breath the whole morning over 1,200 yards of water went still and true. The murmur in her ear stopped. There was nothing left to call. There was only the line, that one clean line between her and the thing at the far end of it that she'd been finding since she was 19 years old, the line where all the noise in the world finally went quiet. She let her breath halfway out and held it there. And Riley Garza, who listened better than anyone the team's ever made, who carried a lost rifle and 3 carved notches and a debt the law had closed, did the one thing she'd been built her whole life to do. The morning took the sound and gave it to the water, and the water carried it off the way water carries everything off, and it was done. She did not stay to watch. There is nothing to watch, no matter what the movies have taught you. A thing like that is geometry, a line and an end of a line, and then it's over and the morning just goes on being a morning. She didn't watch. She worked the bolt one time, calm and smooth, and the sped brass came up out of the action gold and warm, and she caught it in her bare hand before it ever touched the planking. She did not leave it. She had never once in her life left anything she meant to keep. She closed her fist around it the way you close your fist around a thing you've waited 8 months to hold, and she felt the heat of it bleed into her palm, and that, not the shot, not the line, but the warm brass in her hand, that was the closest thing to a goodbye she would ever let herself have. Then she became, the way she had always been best at becoming, no one at all. The rifle went into its case. The bag, the kestrel, the uneaten granola bar, the second round she hadn't needed, all of it into the vest and the pack, every trace, the planking left as bare as she'd found it. She walked up off that dock through the sea grape in a faded fishing vest with a rod over her shoulder, an unremarkable woman heading in from an early morning that hadn't been kind to the bite. She was in the truck before the first neighbor's coffee finished brewing. She was off the quay and onto the highway before anyone across that quiet inlet understood that the man who watched the gulls every morning at 6:47 was not going to be watching them again. And across the water, the gulls came up into the light anyway, the way they did every morning, the way they didn't know to stop doing. There was a coffee cup balanced on a dock rail. There was a slider standing open to the warm salt air. And a little later, nobody's ever pinned down exactly when, there was a very nice boat, bought with $380,000 a man could never quite explain, drifting loose and slow and empty off the end of the pier, with the keys still hanging in the ignition, and no one aboard to answer for any of it at all. They found the boat, of course. A neighbor saw it drifting wrong against the morning and called it in, and the Coast Guard came, and then the sheriff came, and then the kind of quiet people came who arrive when a retired Navy captain goes missing off his own dock in a comfortable town. And friend, here is the thing about that morning that I have turned over in my hands more times than I can count, the thing that tells you everything about who Riley Garza was. They never found him. They dragged that inlet, and they walked those docks, and they ran the tides backward and forward through a computer, and the water gave them nothing, because that's what water does. Water keeps its own counsel. It takes a thing, and it carries it off, and it does not file a report. They never found the round, either. You'd think, a shot like that, a thing like that, there'd be a casing, a fragment, a single piece of evidence a careful person could put under a glass and build a story around. There was nothing. She caught her brass in her bare hand before it kissed the wood, and the only round that mattered had gone the one place no investigator was ever going to subpoena. They had a missing man, an open slider, a cooling cup of coffee, and a boat drifting empty with its keys in the ignition, and not one of those things could be made to say a single word. And they never found the woman in the rental across the inlet who'd paid 6 weeks in cash, and gone fishing every morning, and left the place spotless, and turned the key back into an old snowbird who couldn't have picked her out of a crowd of two. By the time anyone thought to wonder about the polite angler across the water, there was no angler. There was a stucco 2-bedroom with the windows open to air it out, and a forwarding address that led nowhere, and a name on a lease that had never belonged to anybody at all. Some stories end with paperwork, friend. A folder gets closed, a signature goes on a line, A flag gets folded into a triangle and handed to somebody who'll never understand what's inside the box. That's how Marcus Webb's story was made to end, with paperwork, with a lie typed clean and signed by a captain, training accident, no fault assigned. That's the ending they chose for him. This one didn't end with paperwork. This one ended with water. There's no headstone for what happened on that inlet. There's no file. There's no name carved anywhere a stranger could read it. There's just a story the teens tell now, late, low voices, the way you tell a thing that was too heavy to carry any other way, about a quiet woman who listened better than anyone they ever made, who lost the other half of herself to a price tag and a signature, and who carried a lost rifle and 3 card notches 1,200 yards across the water to lay a dead down where the law had refused to. And there's a 3rd notch on a buttstock that nobody but her will ever see, cut slow and deep in a cemetery parking lot that doesn't stand for a man she killed. It stands for the one she couldn't save. It was the only headstone she'd accept for Marcus Webb, and she carried it all the way to the end of the world and back, and as far as anyone knows she's carrying it still. She touched her own breast pocket twice before she pulled out of that driveway. The men who knew them both would understand that gesture. 2 light taps, where he used to keep June's photograph. She'd picked it up off him without meaning to, somewhere across 4 years of lying in the same dirt, the way you pick up the habits of a person you love until you can't tell anymore whose they were to begin with. 2 taps. Then she went quiet. Then she went to work. Then she was gone. Now before I let you go, I want to set this beside something, because the people who keep these stories keep them together, and they belong together. You remember Sydney. Some of you have been with me long enough that you do. They bet against Sydney with cash. A room full of men who thought they had her number put their money on the table and watched her take every dollar of it apart in front of them. That was a bet with cash, and it was ugly enough. But Riley's people, the ones up that chain, the man at the bottom of that signature, they didn't bet with cash. They bet against her partner with a man's whole life. $380,000 laid down on a grid square like a man's life was a hand of cards. And one of those bets got somebody buried in Arlington. The other got a boat left drifting empty off a Florida pier. You decide which one the people who did the betting would rather have made. That's the thing I want you to carry out of here tonight, friend. Not the shot. Everybody wants the shot. I want you to carry the arithmetic, the 8 months of it, the listening, the patience, the cost she counted out ahead of time and paid anyway with her eyes open. Because that's the part that's true even in the parts that sound like a movie. There are people walking around right now who paid a price they thought they'd never have to pay, to a quiet woman they never saw coming, and the only reason the rest of us sleep easy is that those people are so very rare. Sit with that tonight. Sit with a little girl named June and the flag she'll grow up not understanding. Sit with a debt that water carried off where no court could ever reach it. And then go on and live your day, and be grateful you've never had cause to do the math that Riley Garza did. If this one got into you the way the true ones do, you do me a small thing. You leave her name down below, Riley, just so I know it landed, just so I know somebody out there heard it, and won't let it go all the way quiet. These stories live as long as somebody's willing to say the name, and not one day longer. Maggie's already down there in the comments. I'd put money on it, the way she always is. Go sit beside her a minute. You're among people who understand, here? And stay close, because I've got another one, and it's a different kind of dangerous. Riley needed a rifle and 1,200 yards and 8 months of patience. The next one, and I'll tell you her story soon, I promise you that, the next one didn't need any of those things. She needed a key. One single key hung on a chain around a man's neck, and she lifted it off him in the half-second he leaned in to kiss her goodbye, and he never felt her fingers, and he never knew it was gone until it was already turning a lock on the far side of the world. Different woman, different debt, same quiet, same arithmetic. But that, friend, is a story for next time. Pour one out for the fisherman's son from Mobile tonight, the big man who could feel a wind shift in the hair on his arms, who touched his little girl's photo twice and then went to work, every single time, for years running. The water remembers him, even if the file never will. This has been one of those stories nobody was supposed to tell. I'm glad I told it to you. Take care of each other out there.